this is Azadeh Zabati. Welcome to Iran, the Untold Story podcast, where I'm joined today by my guest, Struan Stevenson. Struan was a Conservative member of the European Parliament for Scotland from 1999 to 2014, the former president of the European Parliament's Fisheries Committee, president of the European Parliament's Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development Intergroup, as well as the former president of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with Iraq and the president of the Friends of a Free Iran Intergroup. He is currently the coordinator of the Campaign for Iran Change and the president of the European Iraqi Freedom Association. Struan is also an international lecturer, speaking mainly on human rights and the Middle East, and is also the author of several publications, two of which will be the subject of today's podcast. I'm exceptionally grateful, Struan, that you have found the time to join me today, so thank you so much.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to join you.
Struan, I'd like, if I may, to start off with your book, Iran, Self-Sacrifice, Life with the Iranian Mujahedin, referring to the People's Mujahedin Organization of Iran, which is the opposition movement in exile, as well as the key component to the NCRI. Could you let our listeners know, really, first of all, how and when you were introduced to the organization, and also experiences you have had with its members and its supporters, and then also Self-Sacrifice? Why the title for the book?
Well, Self-Sacrifice, first of all, I should say, is the title because everyone that I have met, from Mrs. Rajavi in the leadership of the organization as president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, right down to the lowliest members in Europe, in the Middle East, people who support the NCRI or the People's Mujahedin of Iran, the MEP, all of them have sacrificed. All of them have given enormous sacrifice to try to win justice, freedom, democracy, human rights, women's rights for the people of Iran, for the 80 million population of Iran who have lived under many decades of oppression, previously under the Shah and now under the mullahs. So the self-sacrifice title was chosen on that basis. I really came across the NCRI shortly after I became an MEP. I was elected, first of all, representing Scotland in the European Parliament back in 1999. And when you're a newly elected member of Parliament, you have a succession of ambassadors knocking on your door, keen to make your acquaintance and tell you about the wonderful things that their country is doing. And on one of these occasions, I had the ambassador for Iran, the ambassador to the European Union, representing the Islamic Republic. And before he entered my office, my staff had drawn my attention to a newspaper article where a 14-year-old girl who had been raped by a member of the Basij, the paramilitary thugs in the Basij, she had been accused of adultery. The Basij man who had raped her, was married. He was sentenced to 70 lashes, and she was summoned before a judge, and he sentenced her to death for adultery. And she was so astonished, she tore off her veil, and the judge said, "Because you have insulted me and insulted my court, I will put the rope around your neck myself." and she was hanged by that judge. I cut out that newspaper article, and when the ambassador from the Islamic Republic came into my office, he started to tell me about all the wonderful things the regime was achieving. And I said, before you say another word, let me show you this newspaper article. I said, any regime that can hang a 14-year-old girl is beyond redemption. And I said, believe me, I will now spend the rest of my political career trying to bring down your regime. Please do not come back to my office ever again. I will not allow you to cross my threshold. I then said to my staff, there's some guys in the parliament who occasionally stop me when I'm walking along the corridors and try to attract me to help the People's Mujahedin, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Please go and find them and tell them to come to my office. I'm willing to hear what they have to say. And shortly after that, I was visited by Firuz Mavi, and I told him, I'm prepared now to help you. And really, that has changed my life. I've been, for more than 20 years, involved very closely in helping the National Council of Resistance of Iran and Mrs. Rajavi. So it has been a career-changing situation for me.
And Struan, you said that it was from your election in 1999 that your association with the organisation began. During the course of this period, have you faced personal obstacles or adverse sort of external pressure, be it overtly or covertly, because of your support for the PMOI and NCRI?
On many, many occasions, when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, I was contacted by one of the junior ministers in his government who was in charge of the Middle East. And he told me that he wanted to come to speak to me about fisheries, because, as you said in your introduction, I was president of the Fisheries Committee. And I said, that's fine, please go ahead. He came to Brussels, and when we met for a cup of coffee, he immediately said, I understand you have agreed to go and address a rally of the National Council of Resistance of Iran in Berlin. And I advise you that that is a very bad idea. You should not do that. And I was absolutely stunned. I said, hang on, I thought you were coming to speak to me about fisheries. But here you are, a minister from the Labour government, telling me, an elected member of parliament, what I should do. I said, please don't try to tell a Conservative member of parliament what to do. I will take my own decisions. But I was absolutely stunned that that should be the case. Years later, because at that time, the NCRI and the MEK were on the US and the EU terrorist list after an absolute disgrace where under President Clinton, he had, in an attempt to appease the mullahs, he had agreed to their demands that the MEK be placed on the terror list, all based on totally false and dubious information provided by the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security. And we fought long and hard for several years until we successfully got them removed from the UK list, the EU list, and ultimately the US list. It was interesting when publication of the information that had gone before the special court in the UK that dealt with matters of this nature. There was a long transcription of a telephone call that I had received from someone claiming to be a senior civil servant in the Foreign Office. I had been again told in this telephone conversation that it was a bad idea, that the government didn't agree that I should be associating myself with the MEK. And I argued that they had no right to try to tell me what to do, the same as I had done with the meeting with the junior minister. And here in the transcript of the evidence given to the judges in the attempt to remove the prescription of the MEK from the UK terror list was a complete transcript of my telephone conversation. And lo and behold, the person who had claimed to be a senior official from the Foreign Office was actually working for MI5. So, you know, the intelligence service were trying to tell me as an elected politician what I should do in my own country. That seemed to me absolutely shocking. The situation also got quite intense at one point when I had invited Mrs. Rajavi to come to address the European People's Party, who were in the majority in the European Parliament at that time. We were the majority group, and I was a senior vice president of the EPP group. Now, it was at the same time that due to revelations from the NCRI, they had established that the Iranian regime was accelerating the development of nuclear weapons. And this had astonished and caught off balance the intelligence services in the West, who had been unaware that such activity was taking place. And the West, the EU sent Javier Solana, who was the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, to Tehran to try to persuade the mullahs not to continue with their work on processing uranium to weapons grade. And because the mullahs had heard that I had invited Mrs. Rajavi to come to Brussels to address the EPP group, we immediately started getting pressure from all the leaders of all the prime ministers and presidents in the EU, of all the member states. We're getting phone calls from Javier Solana from Tehran saying the mullahs are insisting that Stevenson be told to withdraw this invitation to Mrs. Rajavi. Otherwise, the mullahs will stop all negotiations over the nuclear deal. And, you know, I was getting pressure again from my own government. I was in the middle of a meeting of the presidency of the EPP in Brussels when the phone rang in the mobile phone of Otmar Karas, who was sitting next to me as a vice president of the EPP from Austria. And it was the Chancellor of Austria phoning him, shouting at him, "Solana has just telephoned me, you must stop Mrs. Rajavi coming to Brussels." So after all of that, Mrs. Rajavi herself unilaterally agreed to withdraw her own visit to Brussels rather than be accused of trying to upset the nuclear negotiations. But we all knew that the threats from the mullahs that they would continue in good faith with the negotiations provided Mrs. Rajavi withdrew her desire to meet with the EPP group. We all knew that was a lie. And sure enough, after Mrs. Rajavi withdrew, Javier Solana returned to Brussels. And when we questioned him at a full meeting of the European Parliament on how successful his visit had been, he said, sadly, he had made no progress, and the mullahs were continuing to develop their nuclear weapons. So it was a complete lie, a complete falsehood, the usual bluff and bluster from the mullahs. So after that, we resumed the invitation for Mrs. Rajavi to come and speak to the EPP group, and she did so and attended an enormous meeting, one of very many meetings that subsequently she has undertaken in the European Parliament to great effect.
What an extraordinary number of memories that you have shared with us. I'm glad that you have mentioned Mrs. Rajavi, the president-elect of the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Over the years, you have met with her on many occasions and have enjoyed private audience with her. I wonder if you could tell our listeners what you know of Mrs. Rajavi, what you have seen of her values, and also what makes you such a staunch and vocal supporter of the organization that she represents.
Well, first of all, she is an incredibly charismatic and incredibly courageous lady. You know, one particular occasion that I recall with great vivid memory is after we had the long struggle to get the people that were, first of all, trapped in Camp Ashraf in Iraq, and then transferred to near the Camp Liberty near the Baghdad airport, and were constantly under barrage of missile attacks and even military attacks when they were in the original Camp Ashraf. When we finally managed to get them all relocated to Albania, and initially they were staying in accommodation in Tirana, the capital, but then they managed to purchase some farmland and started building Ashraf 3, which has become a small city now. Absolutely incredible. It has risen from the ground, from fields into a small city. I visited several times while Ashraf 3 was being constructed. And during the first winter, when it was under construction, when the weather was terrible, it was freezing cold, it was snowing. Because of the construction work, the fields were covered in mud. Mrs. Rajavi was walking around in wearing Wellington boots and protective clothing, encouraging all of the 3,000 people who had come from Camp Liberty to Albania to work hard to get this new Ashraf 3 built. She was there absolutely, literally working herself. And it really occurred to me what an incredible woman this is. She will never tell anyone to do anything that she is not prepared to do herself. When I first met Mrs. Rajavi, way back in the early part of the 2000s, she at that time spoke fluent French, as well as, of course, her native Farsi, but spoke hardly any English at all. And because I couldn't speak much French, I wasn't able to have very good dialogue at that point. Now Mrs. Rajavi speaks fluent English. To my shame, I still don't speak good French or any Farsi at all. So, you know, she is an incredibly intelligent woman and an incredibly charismatic leader. She has all of the leadership qualities And because of that, she has now got a network of friends and supporters amongst the highest leadership of the political sphere of the world, from America, Australia, Canada, Europe. She has visited virtually every parliament in the European Union.
We'll come back to the policy of appeasement that you've mentioned. When you speak of Mrs. Rajavi's leadership qualities, you are no doubt apprised of her roadmap for a future Iran, the 10-point plan. Why do you believe, Struan, people should get behind her plan?
Well, you know, her plan to have a secular republic with religion and state politics divided, with freedom for people to wear whatever clothing they wish, with an anti-misogyny policy, with the restoration of justice, the restoration of women's rights, of human rights. I mean, this is a 10-point plan that I would be prepared to stand for election under such a manifesto. And it has attracted support from leaders and presidents and prime ministers around the world. So, you know, for a future for the Iranian people, you could ask for nothing better than Mrs. Rajavi's 10-point plan.
Moving on, if I may, to the second book that I wanted to discuss in this podcast, and that is Dictatorship and Revolution, Iran, A Contemporary History. It really is an absolutely fascinating read, and for the benefit of our listeners, it is a book looking at the Iranian people's 120-year struggle for democratic governance and for a free and an open society. Struan, during this book, you begin by looking in depth at the reign of Reza Shah, and then moving on to the reign of his son, Mohammad Reza Shah. Interestingly, you then, in the sort of final part of the book, you look at Khomeini, the architect of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and you illustrate that the successor to the monarchical dictatorship of Iran's last Shah was in fact Khomeini, which I found incredibly interesting and also accurate to my mind. Would you, Struan, kindly give a brief summary of the brutality of monarchical rule in Iran under the Pahlavis, and also a brief description of the Savak and what our listeners should know about it?
Well, of course, the Shah's father, who rose to become the monarch of Iran, he started off as a mercenary. He was an ill-educated, fairly thuggish, brutal mercenary, working as a mercenary for the Russians, for the Cossacks, and rose through the ranks until, through his brutality and his willingness to use violence to suppress protests, he rose to become the leader, and then was invited to become the monarch. And of course, his son, the Shah, inherited that brutality, set up Savak, which became almost a working concept for the Gestapo and you know, organizations of oppression like that. So Savak was notorious for murdering, for arresting, murdering, hanging, executing members of the opposition to the Shah, but as well as academics, artists, people of great literary fame. And Savak just became a nightmare. And eventually, of course, the people of Iran rose up, and in 1979, the Shah fled, never to return, taking with him, according to the New York Times, around $4 billion, which he had plundered, clearly, from the Iranian people. He died a year later, and his son, Reza Pahlavi, in fact, I've called him the man who wasn't there, because there's a famous American poem by an American poet which said, as I was walking down the stair, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. And it occurred to me that Reza Pahlavi is the man who wasn't there. For decades, we heard nothing from him at all. He did nothing. He was living in palatial style on the plundered billions that his father stole from the Iranian people. But every time there is a crisis in Iran, suddenly up pops Reza Pahlavi. It happened after the horrible murder in custody by the morality police of Mahsa Amini in 2022, which led to a nationwide uprising, which continued right into 2023 and had the consequences of a brutal crackdown by the IRGC and by the Basij, leading to 750 deaths and 30,000 people arrested, many of whom have subsequently been executed. And in the course of all of this, Reza Pahlavi suddenly reappears like magic, sniffing the opportunity of the overthrow of the regime and telling everyone, telling the world, this is clear evidence that what the people of Iran really want is the restoration of the monarchy. Despite the fact that during many of the huge protests that were taking place in towns and cities across the whole of Iran, people were chanting, no to the Shah, no to the Sheikh. We don't want autocratic tyranny. We want democracy. He seemed to have been oblivious to these messages. And actually, worse than that, he was being used as a useful idiot by the mullahs. They would send disguised members of the Basij wearing civilian clothing into the middle of some of these demonstrations to shout slogans about bringing back, restoring the monarchy, trying to sow confusion amongst the protesters, trying to give them the message that, oh my God, you know, if we are successful in getting rid of the mullahs regime, maybe it means we will end up with Savak and the restoration of the monarchy. So, you know, trying to use, the mullahs were trying to exploit the sudden reappearance of Reza Pahlavi, using him as a useful idiot to spread confusion. And he has stupidly allowed himself to be exploited in that way. The same thing has happened again in the past 2 or 3 weeks with the elections in March, the first stage of the elections to the Majlis in March, the second stage in May. In both occasions, even the regime has admitted that the turnout of the voting public was less than 8%. In some estimates, we reckon it was under 4%. And Reza Pahlavi, once again, sniffing an opportunity, he suddenly reappears and says, this is proof that the people of Iran want the restoration of the monarchy because so few of them come out to vote for the mullah's regime. Unfortunately, we have discovered that amongst his supporters, he has suddenly got the former head of Savak, who has mysteriously reappeared after being completely invisible for the past 45 years. The former head of SAVAK has reappeared saying that he supports the restoration of the monarchy, and he has even been, there's pictures of him being held up by some of the Reza Pahlavi supporters with the slogan in Farsi, which says he will be the future terror of all the so-called terrorists. He will be the person that will restore the SAVAK kind of brutal justice to people that oppose the monarchy. So, you know, we've also heard that Reza Pahlavi has admitted in TV interviews that he's in negotiation with the IRGC, that he says we would require, after the overthrow of the mullah's regime, we would require the help of the IRGC to maintain order. This, to my mind, is like Winston Churchill after the defeat of Nazi Germany, saying, oh, by the way, I think we need to keep the SS to restore order in post-war Europe. You know, it's incredible. How on earth anyone thinks that there is any future for restoring the monarchy? It is completely redundant. And the man who wasn't there, I wish he'd go away.
Thank you, Struan. Humour my next question. The restoration of the monarchy and a return in Iran to monarchical rule, what are the prospects? Given what you've said, I imagine slim.
The prospects are zero. The people of Iran want freedom. They don't want another autocratic tyranny. They don't want the tyranny of the Shah. They don't want the tyranny of the mullahs and the ayatollahs. They want freedom. And unless we can, you know, get rid of this notion that there is any hope for restoring the monarchy, there is not. The people of Iran will never accept that. And Reza Pahlavi had better get a grip of reality and fade back into invisibility.
And you say, Struan, that the Iranian people do not want monarchical dictatorship or indeed a clerical one. So I wanted to go back to the policy of appeasement that you mentioned earlier in the podcast. What is this policy? How has it hindered the Iranian people in their quest for freedom? And what have really been the consequences for the Iranian people, but also the wider world?
Well, sadly, many of the leaders and governments in the West have pursued this policy of appeasement. When I was an MEP, we were constantly hearing messages from all of the leaders of the EU member states that it's important that we maintain dialogue with the mullahs. It's important that we maintain diplomacy. I'm still hearing it today. David Cameron, Lord Cameron, the foreign minister of the UK, when everybody is demanding the blacklisting of the IRGC, literally everyone, the majority in the European Parliament have called for the blacklisting. Roberta Metsola, the president of the European Parliament, has called for the IRGC to be blacklisted. They were blacklisted by the Americans when President Trump was in charge. Canada has just unanimously voted to blacklist them, including Mr. Trudeau, the Prime Minister. He voted to blacklist them as well. So we're waiting to see now if the Canadian government will follow the instructions of their own parliament and blacklist the IRGC. But here we have Lord Cameron saying, oh, no, if we blacklist the IRGC, they will immediately close our embassy and we'll no longer be able to have dialogue with the mullahs. we would have to work through a subsidiary like Switzerland to have any dialogue. My question is, why do you want to have dialogue with criminals? Why do you want to have discourse with murderers? These are people that have no compunction about sending a registered diplomat, Asadullah Assadi, registered as a diplomat in their embassy in Vienna in Austria. They sent him with a commercially made half-kilo bomb on a commercial airliner to Europe, and he handed it over to 3 co-conspirators, instructing them to go and detonate it at a huge NCRI rally in Paris in 2018, a rally that I attended. It would potentially have killed hundreds and mutilated many thousands more. There were over 100,000 people at that rally. And of course, as part of the appeasement policy, Asadullah Assadi, after being sentenced to 20 years imprisonment for terrorism, he was sent home to Tehran to a hero's welcome because the mullahs had seized a young Belgian charity worker and held him hostage, and then demanded a prisoner swap. And the appeasers in the Belgian parliament immediately agreed that they should allow Assadi to be sent back to Tehran to a hero's welcome in exchange for the Belgian charity worker who had been falsely accused of espionage and sentenced to 40 years imprisonment and 70 lashes. This is the way this criminal gangster regime operate. And the time for appeasement really is over. Not only is it over, we should close the Iranian embassies. We should expel all the so-called diplomats. They use their embassies as terror headquarters where they plan bombing and assassination attacks. They recently were quite clearly behind the attempted assassination of my very close friend for many decades, Alejo Vidal-Quadras, who was senior vice president of the European Parliament. Last November, an assassin acting undoubtedly on behalf and under the orders of the Iranian mullahs shot Alejo in the head in Madrid. And happily, he has survived this attempted assassination. It's always important when it comes to assassination to ask not who fired the shot, but who paid for the bullet. And we know who paid for the bullet in this case. It was the Iranians, for sure.
And Alejo had a meeting, he attended a meeting in London a couple of weeks ago at the Palace of Westminster. And it was interesting when he said that, you know, common sense and pragmatism would dictate that if a policy isn't working, that you change course. And let's hope that the West heed that advice. If I may move on now to fake news, disinformation and misinformation. What have you been apprised of over the years with respect to the NCRI and the PMOI? And do you have any idea where that fake news really emanates from?
Well, we know where it emanates from. It emanates from the MOIS, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security in Iran. They're past masters at sending out disinformation. But it's interesting, in the 2 decades or more that I've been backing the NCRI and the MEK, initially the mullahs described the MEK as, you know, an insignificant little sort of act of annoyance, nothing more than that. You know, it was so small and so tiny and so insignificant, it was causing no problem to anyone at all. Suddenly, you know, they're sending assassins to try to kill anyone that supports the MEK. Suddenly they're sending registered diplomats to try to blow up meetings of the MEK. Suddenly, the MEK is at the top of their list of targets worldwide. So the little insignificant MEK has truly become the main figure of hate of the mullahs now, because they see the MEK as the main democratic opposition, as the most likely organization to lead to their downfall. And that's what they are terrified of. That's why they are panicking. So, you know, the demonization campaign has had many different tentacles, like an octopus. They have infiltrated academics at the highest level of government. They've infiltrated the EU. They have senior advisors who have been exposed, like Eldar Mammadov. When I was an MEK, he was the senior advisor on the Middle East in the socialist group. And every time myself or any of our colleagues put down a motion or an amendment favoring the opposition to the mullahs, he immediately advised the socialist group to axe, to vote against whatever we were trying to achieve, and was always praising the great Iranian regime. He was exposed during the recent Qatargate scandal, when Qatar was seen to have been paying members of the European Parliament and senior officials in a bribery and corruption scandal. He was immediately exposed and sacked by the socialist group. And it kind of fulfilled our predictions that this is where he had been coming from all along. But there was also the question of the, I think they were called the Association of Experts, who were a group of ex-Iranian people or people with Iranian connections, who were actually under the direct control of the foreign minister in Iran and were reporting back to him on their activities. And these were people advising senior governments and advising the European Parliament and the European Commission on the mullahs, advising them what a great condition the Islamic Republic was in, and how nothing but support for the mullahs was a potential good idea. So these people were infiltrating at the highest level. I actually personally was sued by one of them, who had been in a senior position advising the State Department in America, going on television praising the mullahs regime. I called him a spy in an article I wrote when he was arrested by the FBI and charged with having received over $250,000 from the Iranian embassy. And I wrote an article accusing him of being a spy. And he sued me on the grounds that in American justice, espionage and spying are two different things. And he'd been accused of espionage, but not of spying. So in my defense, I told the lady judge in Massachusetts, I said, well, you know, I come from the UK, where we invented James Bond, who was a secret agent and a spy. So I think the judge saw the humor in that, and the case was eventually abandoned. But, you know, these people have infiltrated at the highest level around the Western democracies, telling lies and spreading falsehoods about the MEK, and telling lies and falsehoods about how great the mullahs regime is supposed to be, when we know actually it's a murderous, criminal regime of gangsters.
And it is, as you say, a very sophisticated Iran lobby that operates around the world in civil society and also parliaments. If I may, Struan, I'm going to take you to the present day, given that earlier today it was confirmed by Iran state media that Ebrahim Raisi, as well as Iran's foreign minister and others, have been killed in a helicopter crash in Iran. Struan, given Ebrahim Raisi was the hardest of hardliners, what does his death mean to the Iranian people, and also what consequences could this have?
His death is rather ironic, given that he was killed in an American helicopter, a very old American helicopter, which, due to sanctions, was probably, under repaired and requiring a lot of upgrading. But as the butcher of Tehran, who was so called because of his background as a leading hanging judge, if you like, when he was in charge back in the late 1980s, he was one of the Death Commission who was responsible for the execution of 30,000 political prisoners, almost all of them supporters or members of the MEK. So he had blood in his hands. In the year since he became president, in the year since 2021, when he was elected president in a completely sham election, he was chosen by Khamenei, and actually many people thought that he was a potential successor to the 85-year-old Khamenei. But Raisi, since becoming president, has supervised the execution, a frenzy of executions. Last year alone, 834 people hanged in Iran. Iran is now by far the leading executioner per capita in the world, ahead even of China on a per capita basis. And this is all under the blood-stained hands of Ebrahim Raisi. His fiery death in an American helicopter on the 19th of this month is ironic, but it will certainly destabilize the Iranian regime, given that he was a potential successor to Khamenei, given that he was put in that position because, as a hardliner, Khamenei was hoping that he would terrify the rebellious young people in Iran into submission. And that's why he was carrying out his frenzy of executions to try to prove that it was not worth rising up again. I think now the young people may see this opportunity as a time to rise up and overthrow this regime, because they know that if there is another election where another hardline president will be elbowed into that position by Khamenei without any proper democratic choice, and will be elected by 3 or 4% of the voting population. It's a complete sham, and the Iranian public have had enough of this. They've had enough of the mullahs. They want freedom, they want democracy, they want justice. And I think this will so destabilize the regime that we may now be on the threshold of another nationwide insurgency.
Finally, Struan, may I ask you to leave our audience with 3 adjectives that you would use to describe the Iranian opposition movement, the NCRI and PMOI?
Well, the 3 objectives that I would use are victory, victory, victory.
Struan Stevenson, it's been my absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much.